I have learned that love and murder wear the same face in the fog. They both arrive uninvited, change everything, and leave you questioning what you thought you knew about the world. My name is Evangeline Ashford, and I am what polite society calls an anomaly. At 29, unmarried and unrepentant, I have made a profession of what most women are meant to ignore: the darker truths that hide beneath London's glittering surface. For 6 years, I have worked as a consulting detective, taking cases that Scotland Yard finds too delicate or too scandalous to handle through official channels. The inspectors tolerate me because I am useful. Society tolerates me because I am discreet. My late father, a barrister of some renown, left me enough money to be independent and enough education to be dangerous. I have never regretted the path I chose, though it has cost me everything a woman is supposed to want. The morning I met Nathaniel Crowe, London was drowning in winter mist. It was the second week of December, 1888, and the cold had settled into the city like an unwelcome guest who refuses to leave. I stood in the library of Hartwell House in Belgravia, studying the place where Cecilia Hartwell had died 3 nights before. The room still smelled of beeswax candles and old leather, though now there was something else underneath, something metallic and final that no amount of polish could hide. Inspector Marcus Reed stood beside me, his breath forming small clouds in the chill air. The fire had been left unlit since the murder, as I had requested. I needed to see the room as it had been that night. He watched me with the patient skepticism of a man who has worked with me before and knows better than to interrupt my process. The young woman had been found slumped over her writing desk, a small lacquered box overturned beside her, its contents scattered. No weapon had been found. No obvious signs of violence marked her body, though the physician suspected poison. The most curious detail was the missing letter. According to the household staff, Miss Hartwell had received a correspondence that afternoon that left her visibly distressed. She had taken it with her to the library after dinner. By morning she was dead, and the letter had vanished. I knelt beside the desk, studying the pattern of disturbance. Books had been pulled from the lower shelves. The ink bottle had been knocked over, leaving a dark stain across the Persian rug. Someone had searched this room, and they had done so in haste. I could see it in the carelessness of the disorder, the way drawers had been yanked open and left ajar. This was not the work of a methodical mind. This was desperation. Inspector Reed cleared his throat. He was a good man, competent and fair, though he possessed the particular blindness of someone who has never needed to question his place in the world. He told me there was a witness, a man who had been seen near the house the night of the murder, a bookseller from Bloomsbury named Nathaniel Crowe. He had arrived at Hartwell House that evening to deliver a rare volume Miss Hartwell had commissioned. The butler remembered him because he had lingered on the steps, looking up at the house with an odd intensity, as if memorizing its facade. I asked if Mr. Crowe had been inside. The inspector said no. The butler had taken the book at the door and sent him away. But a neighbor reported seeing a man matching his description walking past the house twice more that evening, once around 8 and again near midnight. The timeline troubled me. What reason would a bookseller have to circle a client's home for hours in the freezing December night? Reed suggested we interview him together. I agreed, though I felt a strange reluctance I could not name. Perhaps it was simply the weight of the case, the knowledge that Cecilia Hartwell had been only 23, with her whole life still unwritten before her. Or perhaps it was something else, some instinct I had learned to trust even when I could not explain it. We took a hansom cab through streets slick with frost and shadow. The city looked like a watercolor left in the rain, all blurred edges and muted colors. Gas lamps floated in the fog like distant moons. I watched the world pass outside the window and thought about the letter, the one piece of evidence that could answer everything, now lost or deliberately hidden. In my experience, when someone takes a letter from a crime scene, it is because that letter contains a name they do not wish revealed. Crowe's bookshop occupied a narrow building in a quiet street near the British Museum. The sign above the door read, "Antiquarian Books and Manuscripts," in faded gold lettering. Through the window, I could see floor-to-ceiling shelves packed tight with volumes, and a single lamp burning in the back. Reed pushed open the door, and a small bell announced our arrival. The smell of old paper and dust enveloped me immediately, familiar and oddly comforting. I have always loved bookshops. They are places where secrets are kept and shared in equal measure, where the past speaks to anyone willing to listen. A man emerged from between the shelves, and I felt something in my chest tighten without warning. Nathaniel Crow was not what I had expected. He was perhaps 35, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he forgot to comb it. He wore a simple wool suit, well made but worn at the cuffs, and his hands were stained with ink. But it was his eyes that held me, gray as the winter sky, and filled with an intelligence that seemed to take in everything at once. When he looked at me, I had the unsettling sensation that he saw past the careful armor I wore, straight through to the lonely, restless woman beneath. Inspector Reed introduced us both and explained the purpose of our visit. Nathaniel listened without interruption, his expression grave. When Reed finished, he nodded slowly and invited us to sit near the small iron stove that heated the shop. He poured tea from a battered pot without asking if we wanted it, and I found myself grateful for the warmth of the cup in my hands. He confirmed that he had delivered a book to Hartwell House that evening, a first edition of The Castle of Otranto that Miss Hartwell had been searching for. He said she was a regular customer, passionate about Gothic literature and ghost stories. He had spoken with her only twice before, both times here in the shop, but he remembered her as kind and unusually well-read for someone of her position. There was genuine sadness in his voice when he spoke of her death. Reed asked why he had returned to the house twice more that night. Nathaniel set down his teacup and met the inspector's gaze directly. He said he had been troubled by something Miss Hartwell had said when she collected the book the previous week. She had asked him if he knew anything about codes or ciphers. She had shown him a page of what looked like nonsense writing and asked if he thought it could be decrypted. He had told her he was no expert, but suggested she consult someone at the university. She had thanked him and left, but the memory of her worried face had stayed with him. That evening, after delivering the book, he said he felt an inexplicable unease. He told himself it was foolish, but he could not shake the feeling that Miss Hartwell was in some kind of danger. So he had walked back past the house, telling himself he would only feel better once he saw that the windows were lit and the household seemed at peace. The second time, near midnight, he had seen a figure leaving through the servants' entrance at the side of the house, a man in a dark coat and hat moving quickly toward the mews. Nathaniel had considered following, but decided it was none of his business. Now he regretted that choice deeply. I asked if he could describe the man he had seen. Nathaniel closed his eyes, as if replaying the scene in his mind. He said the man was of medium height and build, nothing distinctive, but there had been something in the way he moved, furtive and hurried, that had caught his attention. The mist had been too thick to see his face clearly. Inspector Reed wrote this down with the careful penmanship of official documentation. I watched Nathaniel as he spoke, noting the way his hands moved when he described what he had seen, the precision of his language, the steadiness of his voice. He was either telling the truth or he was the most skilled liar I had ever encountered. I could not yet decide which. The interview concluded, and Reed said we would likely need to speak with him again as the investigation progressed. Nathaniel assured us he would make himself available at any time. As we stood to leave, his eyes met mine once more, and he said something that surprised me. He told me he had read about my work, that a colleague of his had mentioned the lady detective who had solved the Kensington blackmail case the previous year. He said he thought it took great courage to do what I did in a world that would rather I did not exist. I did not know what to say. I am accustomed to suspicion and condescension, even from those who hire me. Genuine respect, especially from a man, was a rarity I had not learned to accept gracefully. I thanked him quietly and left the shop with Inspector Reed, stepping back into the cold, gray afternoon. As we walked to find another cab, Reed remarked that Crow seemed sincere. I agreed, though something nagged at the edges of my mind, a detail I could not quite grasp. We parted ways at the corner, Reed returning to Scotland Yard and I heading home to my small flat in Bloomsbury, where I would spend the evening reviewing my notes and considering what I had learned. But that night, as I sat by my fire with a cup of tea and the case file spread before me, I found my thoughts drifting not to the murder or the missing letter, but to the gray-eyed bookseller who had looked at me as if I were a puzzle he wanted to solve. I told myself it was the strangeness of the day, the melancholy weight of a young woman's death, that made me feel so unmoored. I told myself that sentiment had no place in my work, that I had built my life on logic and observation, not feeling. Yet when I finally closed my eyes that night, it was Nathaniel Crow's face I saw in the darkness, and the memory of his voice saying my name like it was something precious and rare. The days that followed were filled with the methodical work of investigation, but beneath every interview and every clue, I felt the current of something else, something I had no name for. I told myself it was simply the intensity of the case, the pressure of finding justice for a young woman whose life had been cut short. But in the quiet moments, when I reviewed my notes by lamplight or walked through the fog-shrouded streets, I knew I was lying to myself. Inspector Reed and I interviewed the Hartwell household staff one by one. The butler, Mr. Pembroke, was a man of 60 with the rigid dignity of long service. He confirmed that Miss Cecilia had been agitated after receiving the afternoon post. She had taken one letter upstairs to her room and remained there for nearly an hour. When she emerged for dinner, her eyes were red, though she claimed it was merely a headache. After the meal, she had retired to the library, requesting that she not be disturbed. The next morning, the housemaid had found her dead. The cook, Mrs. Dalton, remembered preparing Miss Cecilia's favorite dishes that evening, trying to tempt her appetite. She said the young mistress had seemed troubled for weeks, ever since returning from a house party in Kent. There had been a gentleman there. Mrs. Dalton had heard from the lady's maid, someone Miss Cecilia had developed feelings for. But the attachment had not been encouraged by her family. The Hartwells were old money, proud and particular about bloodlines. A suitor without proper connections would have been dismissed without consideration. I asked about the gentleman's name. Mrs. Dalton did not know it, only that he had written to Miss Cecilia several times afterward. The lady's maid, a nervous young woman named Alice, confirmed this but insisted she had never read the letters. She only knew they arrived with a London postmark and that Miss Cecilia kept them locked in the small lacquered box on her writing desk, the same box that had been overturned the night of her death, its contents scattered and presumably taken by whoever had searched the library. The pattern was becoming clearer. A forbidden attachment, letters that needed to remain secret, a young woman caught between duty and desire, and then a final letter that had somehow pushed events past the point of return. But who had written it, and what had it contained? Those were the questions that kept me awake at night. 3 days after our first meeting, I found myself returning to Nathaniel Crow's bookshop. I told myself it was because he might remember additional details about Miss Hartwell's interest in codes and ciphers. I told myself it was merely thorough detective work. But as I stood outside the shop in the gray afternoon light, watching the warm glow of lamplight through the window, I knew I was there for reasons that had nothing to do with the case. The bell chimed as I entered. Nathaniel was standing on a ladder, reaching for a volume on the highest shelf. He turned at the sound, and his face brightened when he saw me. He descended quickly, brushing dust from his hands, and greeted me with a warmth that felt both surprising and entirely natural. He asked if there had been progress in the investigation. I told him we were following several leads, but that I had questions about Miss Hartwell's interest in ciphers. He nodded and gestured for me to follow him to the back of the shop, where he kept his private collection of rare volumes. The space was small and cluttered, filled with stacks of books and manuscripts that seemed to overflow from every surface. A kettle sat on a small spirit burner, and 2 mismatched chairs faced each other across a worn table. He made tea without asking, the same ritual as before, and I found myself grateful for his quiet assumption of hospitality. As we sat, he explained that cryptography had become quite fashionable in certain intellectual circles, particularly among those interested in secret societies and occult practices. Miss Hartwell had mentioned attending a lecture on the subject at the Society for Psychical Research. She had seemed fascinated by the idea that messages could hide within other messages, that truth could wear the mask of nonsense. I asked if he still had the page she had shown him, the one with the strange writing. He shook his head and said she had taken it with her. But he remembered it had looked like random letters arranged in groups, possibly a substitution cipher or something more complex. He had suggested she might be looking at a book cipher, where each group of numbers corresponded to a word in a specific text. Without knowing which book served as the key, such codes were nearly impossible to break. As he spoke, I studied his face. the way his eyes lit with genuine interest when discussing books and puzzles, the careful way he chose his words. There was something about him that felt solid and true in a world that often seemed built on deception. I found myself wanting to trust him, which frightened me more than I cared to admit. Trust was a luxury I had learned to do without. He asked about my work, how I had come to be a detective when every door in that profession was barred to women. I found myself telling him things I rarely shared, about my father's encouragement of my education, about the cases I had solved through observation and logic when men had overlooked the obvious, about the loneliness of being respected for my mind while being dismissed as a woman. He listened with an attention that felt complete, as if my words mattered in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. The afternoon faded into evening as we talked. At some point, he lit another lamp, and the small room filled with a golden glow that seemed to exist outside of time. We discussed literature and philosophy, the nature of truth and deception, the ways people hide themselves even when they believe they are being honest. I realized I had not spoken so freely with anyone in years, perhaps ever. There was something in his presence that made me feel less guarded, as if the armor I wore could be set aside, at least for a moment. When I finally stood to leave, reluctant but knowing I had stayed far longer than propriety allowed, he walked me to the door. The street outside was dark and cold, the fog rolling in thick from the Thames. He asked if I would permit him to see me home, given the late hour and the dangerous state of the streets. I should have refused. I should have maintained the professional distance that was already dissolving between us. Instead, I accepted. We walked through the lamplit streets in comfortable silence, our breath forming small clouds in the winter air. The city felt like a dream around us, muffled and strange. When we reached my building, he bid me good night with a formality that seemed at odds with the intimacy of the hours we had just shared. But as I climbed the stairs to my flat, I felt his gaze following me, and I knew something had shifted between us that could not easily be undone. That night, I lay awake thinking not about the case, but about the way he had looked at me when I spoke, as if my thoughts were worth hearing, as if I were more than the sum of society's expectations. I thought about his hands, ink-stained and gentle, and the way his voice softened when he spoke of books he loved. I thought about the danger of allowing myself to feel something I had spent years convincing myself I did not need. The next morning brought a letter from Inspector Reed. A witness had come forward, a street vendor who sold chestnuts near Hartwell House. He claimed to have seen a man on the night of the murder, someone matching Nathaniel's description, not walking past the house, but standing in the shadows across the street, watching the windows for nearly an hour. The timeline did not match what Nathaniel had told us. He had said he passed by twice, briefly, both times. He had said nothing about lingering, about watching. I read the letter 3 times, searching for some other interpretation, some way to reconcile this new information with the man I had spent the previous evening with. But the facts were clear. Either the witness was mistaken, or Nathaniel had lied. And if he had lied about this, what else had he concealed? My hands trembled as I set the letter down. I felt something crack inside me, some fragile hope I had not even realized I was holding. I had allowed myself to forget the first rule of investigation, the one my father had taught me. Everyone lies, especially when they have something to lose. I had let attraction cloud my judgment, had mistaken intellectual companionship for innocence. It was a mistake I could not afford to make, not when a young woman's murder remained unsolved. I dressed quickly and made my way to Scotland Yard, where Reed was waiting. We would need to interview Nathaniel again, this time with less courtesy and more suspicion. But as I walked through the cold morning streets, I felt grief mixing with my anger. Not grief for what was, but for what I had briefly imagined might be possible. For the connection I had felt and would now have to sever. For the man I had wanted him to be, who perhaps had never existed at all. The investigation had become something else now, something personal and painful, and I did not yet know if I had the strength to see it through to its bitter end. We arrived at the bookshop just before noon, Reed and I, and the bell's cheerful chime felt like a mockery of the heaviness in my chest. Nathaniel emerged from the back room, and when he saw my face, his smile faded. He knew immediately that something had changed. Inspector Reed wasted no time with pleasantries. He explained about the chestnut vendor, about the testimony that placed Nathaniel outside Hartwell House for far longer than he had admitted, standing in the shadows and watching the windows with what the vendor described as unusual intensity. Reed's voice was professional and cold, the voice of a man who has seen too many lies to be surprised by one more. Nathaniel's face went pale, but he did not look away. He asked if we might speak privately, gesturing toward the back room. Reed agreed, though his hand remained near the notebook in his pocket, ready to record whatever confession or excuse might follow. I followed them both, feeling as if I were walking toward something I could not bear to witness. In the small, cluttered space where we had sat the evening before, drinking tea and talking of ciphers and truth, Nathaniel faced us both and spoke. He said he had not been entirely honest, and for that, he was deeply sorry. The truth was more complicated than he had wanted to admit, more painful to speak aloud. He had indeed stood outside Hartwell House that night, watching and waiting, but not for the reasons we might suspect. He told us then about his sister Margaret, who had died 7 years before, at the age of 20. She had fallen in love with a man above her station, a gentleman who had made promises he never intended to keep. When Margaret found herself with child, the man had abandoned her completely, refusing even to acknowledge her letters. She had died in childbirth in a charity hospital, alone and heartbroken, while the man went on to marry someone suitable and respectable. Nathaniel had been unable to save her, unable even to find her in time to say goodbye. When Miss Hartwell had come to his shop asking about codes and showing him letters written in cipher, when she had seemed so anxious and troubled, he had seen his sister's ghost in her face. He had recognized the particular desperation of a young woman caught in a trap created by love and society's rules. After delivering the book that evening, he had been unable to shake the feeling that history was repeating itself, that another young woman was in danger of the same cruel fate. So he had returned and watched, hoping to see some sign that she was safe, that the household was peaceful, that his fears were unfounded. He had seen nothing unusual through the windows, only the normal movements of servants preparing the house for night. He had been about to leave when he saw the man in the dark coat emerging from the side entrance. He had thought of following, of confronting him, but what right did he have? He was no one to Miss Hartwell, merely a bookseller who had sold her a Gothic novel. So he had let the man disappear into the fog, and now she was dead, and he could not forgive himself for his cowardice. Inspector Reed listened with the careful attention of a man trained to separate truth from invention. He asked why Nathaniel had not told us this from the beginning. Nathaniel said simply that he had not wanted to speak of his sister, had not wanted to expose her memory to official scrutiny and judgment. He had thought the partial truth would be enough, that his hesitation to mention how long he had watched would not matter. He had been wrong, and he understood how it made him look. I stood silent through all of this, watching his face, listening not just to his words, but to the pain beneath them. I knew grief when I saw it. I knew the weight of guilt that came from being unable to save someone you loved, and I knew, with a certainty that felt like both relief and anguish, that he was telling the truth. Reed was less convinced. He asked if Nathaniel had any proof of his sister's story, any documentation that might verify what he claimed. Nathaniel said the only proof was in the parish records of her death and burial, which Reed could easily check. As for the rest, the gentleman's name was Arthur Hartwell, Cecilia's uncle, who had died 3 years ago in a riding accident. Margaret had told Nathaniel everything in her final letter, the one that had arrived too late for him to reach her. He still had that letter, if we wished to see it. The name struck me like a physical blow. Arthur Hartwell. I thought of the family portraits in the library, of the people I had questioned. Cecilia's father had mentioned a younger brother, wild and careless with money, who had died before his debts could completely ruin the family name. There had been relief in his voice when he spoke of it, a coldness that had troubled me at the time. Now I understood why. Reed and I exchanged glances. The case was shifting again, revealing new patterns beneath the surface. If Arthur Hartwell had been the man who destroyed Nathaniel's sister, then Nathaniel had a motive for revenge against the family. But he also had a reason to protect Cecilia, to see her as another victim of the same cruel system that had killed Margaret. The question was, which impulse had been stronger on the night she died? I asked quietly if I might see Margaret's letter. Nathaniel nodded and retrieved it from a locked drawer in his desk. The paper was thin and worn from being folded and unfolded countless times. The handwriting was delicate and increasingly erratic, the words of a young woman in despair. She wrote of her love for Arthur, of his promises and his subsequent abandonment, of her shame and fear. She begged Nathaniel to forgive her, to remember her kindly. She said she knew she would not survive what was coming, and she hoped God would be more merciful than the world had been. I read it twice, feeling tears burn behind my eyes, though I would not let them fall. Reed read it as well, his expression carefully neutral. When he finished, he folded it and returned it to Nathaniel without comment. But I saw something shift in his face, a slight softening that told me he too believed the story. The inspector said we would verify the parish records and asked Nathaniel not to leave London until the investigation was complete. Nathaniel agreed without protest. As Reed moved toward the door, clearly expecting me to follow, I found myself hesitating. There was something I needed to say, something I needed to know. I asked Reed to give me a moment. He frowned, but stepped outside, leaving Nathaniel and me alone in the small room that suddenly felt charged with everything unspoken between us. I told Nathaniel I was sorry about his sister, sorry for the world that had failed her so completely. He thanked me with a formality that felt like armor, as if he too was struggling to maintain the distance that the investigation required. Then I asked the question that had been burning in my mind since reading Margaret's letter. I asked if he blamed Cecilia for her uncle's crimes, if some part of him wanted to see the Hartwell family suffer as he had suffered. He looked at me with those gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to my soul, and he said no. He said he had spent years learning the difference between justice and revenge, between righteous anger and the poison of hatred. Cecilia was innocent of her uncle's sins. She deserved protection and compassion, not punishment for being born into the wrong family. That was why he had watched the house that night, why he had hoped to see something that might help her, why he regretted so deeply his failure to act when he saw the man leaving. I believed him. Perhaps I was a fool to do so. Perhaps my judgment was compromised by feelings I barely understood. But I believed him, and that belief changed everything. I left the bookshop with Reed, stepping back into the cold December afternoon. As we walked, the inspector told me he would verify Nathaniel's story, but that the man remained a suspect. The motive was there, the opportunity was there, and only his words supported his version of events. I knew Reed was right to be cautious. It was good detective work, but something in me had shifted irrevocably, some certainty that felt both dangerous and absolutely true. That evening, I sat in my flat reviewing everything we knew. A young woman poisoned, a letter stolen, a mysterious man seen leaving the house, a family with secrets, an uncle's past sins, a witness with his own tragic history, and somewhere in all of it, a cipher that might hold the key to everything, if only we could break it. I thought about codes and keys, about messages hidden within other messages. I thought about Miss Hartwell's fascination with cryptography, her visits to lectures on secret writing. And then I remembered something Mrs. Dalton had said about Cecilia having a favorite book she read constantly, a volume of poems she kept with her always, a book that might serve as the key to unlock whatever secrets the cipher held. I knew then what I had to do. I had to return to Hartwell House and find that book, and I had to do it before whoever had killed Cecilia realized its significance and destroyed it as they had destroyed the letters. The investigation was far from over, and the truth, when it finally emerged, would be more complex and painful than any of us had imagined. I returned to Hartwell House the following morning with Inspector Reed's authorization to examine Cecilia's personal effects more thoroughly. The household was subdued, wrapped in the particular silence that death brings to a home. Mr. Pembroke led me upstairs to Cecilia's bedroom, a space I had not yet entered during the investigation. He left me there with a look of profound sadness, as if the room itself was a wound that would not heal. The chamber was decorated in shades of cream and rose, with watercolors of countryside scenes on the walls and lace curtains that filtered the gray winter light. Everything was neat and carefully arranged, preserved exactly as it had been when she lived. On the nightstand sat a small stack of books, and my heart quickened when I saw the worn leather volume on top. I opened it carefully and found what I had hoped for. A collection of poems by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the pages soft from repeated reading, certain passages marked with faint pencil lines. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the book to the first marked poem. If this was indeed the key to the cipher, then each group of numbers in the coded message would correspond to a specific word on a specific page. It was an elegant system, nearly impossible to break without knowing which book served as the key. I wished desperately that I had the coded message itself, but that had disappeared with the killer. All I could do was search the room for any other papers that might contain fragments of the cipher or reveal what Cecilia had been trying to hide. I went through her writing desk methodically, checking every drawer, every scrap of paper. Most of what I found were ordinary correspondence, invitations to dinners and balls, thank you notes to friends. But tucked inside a false bottom of the smallest drawer, I discovered a single sheet of paper covered in groups of numbers. My hands trembled as I held it. This was it, the key to everything. I spent the next 2 hours working through the cipher, using the Browning volume as my guide. It was painstaking work, each number leading me to a specific page and word position. Gradually, a message emerged, and with it, the truth I had been seeking. The decoded text was a letter from a man named Edward Whitmore, a solicitor's clerk whom Cecilia had met at the house party in Kent. He wrote of his love for her, of his knowledge that her family would never accept him due to his modest position. He spoke of a plan to elope, to begin a new life together far from London's judgment. But then the tone changed. He wrote of a terrible discovery he had made while organizing files at his firm. He had found evidence that Cecilia's father had been involved in fraud years ago, falsifying documents to secure a business deal that had ruined several families. The proof was locked in the firm's vault, and Edward had made copies. He had not wanted to tell Cecilia, had hoped to simply destroy the evidence and forget what he had seen. But someone else had discovered what he knew. He had received threats, warnings to stay silent or face consequences. The final paragraph of the letter was the most chilling. Edward wrote that he feared for both their lives, that he was being followed, that Cecilia must destroy all correspondence between them and pretend they had never met. He begged her forgiveness for bringing danger to her door and said he would leave London immediately, praying that his absence would keep her safe. The letter was dated 2 days before Cecilia's death. I sat back, the full picture finally clear in my mind. Cecilia had been killed not for love or passion, but to protect a secret, to ensure that Edward's discovery died with anyone who might have knowledge of it. And that meant Edward himself was likely in grave danger, if he still lived at all. I needed to find him immediately, but I also needed to verify what I had learned. I gathered the cipher text and the Browning volume and left Hartwell House with a promise to Mr. Pembroke that I would return anything I borrowed. As I stepped into the cold afternoon, I saw a familiar figure standing across the street. Nathaniel Crowe, wrapped in a dark coat, his breath forming clouds in the winter air. When he saw me, he crossed the street quickly. He apologized for his presence, said he knew he should stay away from the investigation, but he had been unable to stop thinking about the case, about Cecilia, about me. He asked if I had made progress, and something in his eyes, a desperate hope mixed with fear, made me decide to trust him completely. I told him what I had found, about the cipher and the decoded message, about the fraud and the threats. He listened with growing alarm and then said something that made my blood run cold. He told me he knew the solicitor's firm Edward Whitmore worked for. It was Hartwell and Associates, owned by Cecilia's father. The implications crashed over me like a wave. Edward had not worked for just any firm. He had worked directly for the man whose crimes he had discovered. That meant Cecilia's father had known about Edward's findings, had likely been the one making the threats. And when those threats had failed to ensure silence, when Edward had confided in Cecilia, her own father had decided that she too was a liability that could not be allowed to live. I felt sick with the horror of it. A father who would murder his own daughter to protect his reputation, to hide crimes committed years ago. It explained the missing letter, the hasty search of the library, the poison that would appear natural if not examined too closely. Mr. Hartwell had killed Cecilia and framed it as a mysterious death, betting that no one would look too deeply into the tragedy of a young woman's sudden passing. Nathaniel asked what I would do now. I told him I had to find Edward Whitmore and warn him, then present my evidence to Inspector Reed. The case against Mr. Hartwell would be circumstantial but compelling, especially if Edward could testify to the threats and the fraud. But first, I needed to locate a man who might already be dead, or so well hidden that finding him would be impossible. Nathaniel offered his help. He said he had contacts throughout London, people who dealt in information and secrets. If Edward Whitmore was alive and in the city, Nathaniel could find him. I should have refused. I should have kept him separate from the investigation, maintained the professional distance that was already dangerously compromised. But I needed his help, and more than that, I needed him beside me. So I agreed, and we set out together into the darkening afternoon. We spent hours moving through the back streets and forgotten corners of London, speaking with people who lived in the spaces between respectability and poverty. Nathaniel seemed to know everyone, from the old woman who sold flowers near the train station to the bookbinder who worked in a basement shop near the docks. Each person he spoke to listened carefully and promised to send word if they heard anything. I watched him work and saw a different side of him, someone who moved easily between worlds, who understood that information flowed not through official channels, but through the quiet networks of ordinary people who saw everything and were often overlooked. As night fell and the gas lamps flickered to life, we found ourselves in a coffee house near Covent Garden, warming ourselves by the fire and waiting for word from Nathaniel's contacts. He bought us both coffee and bread, insisting I eat something after the long day. As we sat in the corner booth, steam rising from our cups, he asked me about my life, about what had led me to become a detective when every door should have been closed to me. I told him about my father, about the way he had treated me as an intellectual equal when most men saw women as decorative ornaments. I told him about the cases I had solved, the people I had helped, the satisfaction of finding truth in a world built on lies. But I also told him about the loneliness, about being neither fully accepted by the professional world nor welcome in the domestic sphere where women were supposed to find fulfillment. I told him I had made peace with my choices, but that peace sometimes felt more like resignation. He listened, and then he said something that changed everything between us. He said he thought I was the bravest person he had ever met, that my intelligence and compassion were not contradictions, but the same quality expressed in different ways. He said the world did not deserve someone like me, but that he was grateful beyond measure to have found me. And then, with a hesitation that made him seem suddenly vulnerable, he told me that he had not been able to stop thinking about me since the moment we met, that my presence had awakened something in him he thought had died with Margaret, something like hope. I did not know what to say. I had spent so many years protecting myself from precisely this moment, from the risk of wanting something I believed I could never have. But sitting there in the warm glow of the coffee house, with the noise of London muffled beyond the walls, I felt the armor I wore begin to crack. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his, feeling the warmth of his skin, the ink stains that marked him as a man who lived with words and ideas. I told him I felt the same. I told him I was terrified of what that meant, of how it might compromise everything I had built, of how loving him could destroy the careful independence I had fought so hard to achieve. He turned his hand to clasp mine and said he would never ask me to be anything other than what I was, that loving me meant honoring the woman who solved murders and defied convention, not trying to remake her into something acceptable. We sat like that for a long moment, hands joined across the table, and I felt something settle in my chest that I had not even known was unsettled. This was what I had been missing, what I had convinced myself I did not need. Not romance in the conventional sense, not the surrender of self that marriage demanded of women, but partnership, recognition, the simple gift of being seen completely and loved not despite my strangeness, but because of it. A boy appeared at our table then, breathless from running, with a message from one of Nathaniel's contacts. Edward Whitmore was alive and hiding in a boarding house in Whitechapel. We left immediately, making our way through the dark streets toward the East End, toward the final piece of the puzzle that would either save an innocent man or lead us both into danger we might not survive. The boarding house in Whitechapel was a narrow building wedged between a pawn shop and a closed factory, the kind of place where people came to disappear. Nathaniel knocked on the door, using a pattern he said would identify us as friends rather than threats. A woman answered, her face lined with suspicion and hardship. But when Nathaniel mentioned the name of the contact who had sent us, she stepped aside and gestured toward the stairs. Edward Whitmore's room was on the 3rd floor, barely large enough for the narrow bed and washstand it contained. The man who opened the door was young, perhaps 25, with the haunted look of someone who has not slept properly in days. When I explained who I was and why we had come, he nearly collapsed with relief. He had been living in terror, expecting every knock to be his last, every shadow to contain an assassin sent by Mr. Hartwell. He confirmed everything I had pieced together from the cipher. He told us about discovering the fraudulent documents while organizing old case files, about his horror when he realized what they meant. He had made copies, thinking to use them to pressure Mr. Hartwell into accepting his relationship with Cecilia, a desperate gamble he now recognized as catastrophically foolish. The threats had begun immediately. Notes left at his lodgings, a man following him through the streets, messages making it clear that he and anyone he had told would meet with accidents if he did not destroy the evidence and disappear. He had written to Cecilia in cipher, using the code they had devised together during their courtship as a way to send letters her family would not understand. He had begged her to forget him, to burn everything he had ever written. But instead, she had confronted her father, demanded to know if the accusations were true. Edward had learned of this from a housemaid who was sympathetic to their romance. 3 days later, Cecilia was dead, and Edward knew with absolute certainty that her father had killed her. I asked if he still had the evidence, the copies of the fraudulent documents. He retrieved them from beneath a loose floorboard, papers that detailed how Mr. Hartwell had forged signatures and altered contracts to claim ownership of properties that should have gone to the families of deceased partners. The fraud had enriched the Hartwells considerably while leaving other families in ruin. It was exactly the kind of scandal that would destroy not just Mr. Hartwell, but the entire family's position in society. Nathaniel and I looked at each other, and I saw my own thoughts reflected in his eyes. We had the proof we needed, but presenting it meant exposing Edward to enormous danger. Mr. Hartwell had already killed once to protect his secret. He would not hesitate to kill again, and this time he would be more careful to ensure no evidence remained. I told Edward we needed to move quickly, to take everything to Inspector Reed before Mr. Hartwell realized we had found him. But as we descended the stairs, I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, the sensation of being watched. I paused at the 2nd floor landing and looked out the grimy window to the street below. My heart stopped. A carriage stood in the shadows across the street, and beside it, I could make out the figure of Mr. Hartwell himself, along with 2 other men whose bearing suggested they were not servants. We had been followed, or perhaps Mr. Hartwell had his own network of informants who had warned him of our investigation. Either way, we were trapped. The only exit led directly onto the street where he waited. I looked at Nathaniel and Edward and made a decision born of desperation and defiance. We would not hide. We would not run. We would confront him directly in public, where his violence would be witnessed and where our deaths would raise questions he could not afford to answer. We walked out of the boarding house together, the 3 of us, and crossed the street to where Mr. Hartwell stood. He was a man in his 50s, distinguished and cold, with the kind of face that had learned to hide every emotion behind a mask of respectability. When he saw us approaching, something flickered in his eyes, calculation mixed with rage. He greeted me by name with false courtesy, asked what business I had in Whitechapel at such an hour. I told him we had been interviewing Mr. Whitmore about his daughter's death, and that we had made a remarkable discovery about the true motive for her murder. I said the words loudly enough for the people on the street to hear, for the vendors closing their stalls and the workers returning home. I wanted witnesses, wanted this confrontation to be as public as possible. Mr. Hartwell's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the monster beneath. He told me I was interfering in matters I did not understand, that a woman playing at detective was a danger to herself and others. He suggested I return home before I met with an unfortunate accident. The threat was barely veiled, and the 2 men beside him moved closer, their intentions clear. But Nathaniel stepped forward, placing himself between Mr. Hartwell and me, and said in a voice that carried across the street that if anything happened to either of us, copies of the evidence had already been delivered to Scotland Yard, to 3 separate newspapers, and to solicitors with instructions to make everything public should we disappear. It was a bluff, but it was delivered with such conviction that Mr. Hartwell hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, I saw Inspector Reed emerge from a doorway further down the street, accompanied by 2 constables. Relief flooded through me. I had sent word to Reed earlier in the day, telling him to meet us in Whitechapel if I did not return to Scotland Yard by nightfall. He had come, and his presence meant we were safe. The arrest of Mr. Hartwell happened quickly after that. Edward's testimony and the fraudulent documents provided overwhelming evidence not just of financial crimes, but of motive for murder. The investigation into Cecilia's death was reopened, and this time the physician found traces of arsenic in samples that had been preserved. Mr. Hartwell had purchased the poison months earlier, claiming it was for rats in his warehouse. The case against him was complete. The trial that followed was a sensation in the newspapers, though I took no pleasure in the publicity. What I had sought was justice for a young woman who had deserved so much more than the cruelty fate had dealt her. Cecilia had loved and been loved, had tried to do right in an impossible situation, and had died for it. Her father was convicted and sentenced to hang, a fate that seemed both appropriate and insufficient given the magnitude of his crimes. In the months that followed, as winter gave way to spring, I found myself changed in ways I had not anticipated. The case had tested not just my skills as a detective, but my understanding of what I wanted from life. I had built my existence around the belief that independence meant solitude, that being free required being alone. But Nathaniel had shown me a different possibility, a way of being both myself and part of something larger. We married quietly in April, in a small ceremony attended only by Inspector Reed and a few of Nathaniel's friends from the book trade. I kept my name, continued my work as a detective, and maintained my flat as an office for my investigations. But I also had a home now, in the rooms above Nathaniel's bookshop, a place where I could set down the armor I wore and simply be Evangeline, the woman who loved a man who saw her completely and asked her to change nothing. Edward Whitmore used the reward money from solving the case to start a new life in America, far from the tragedy that had marked his time in London. Before he left, he came to thank me and to leave me Cecilia's volume of Browning poems, saying he could not bear to keep it but hoped I would treasure it as she had. I placed it on the shelf in my office, a reminder of the cost of secrets and the price of love in a world not designed for honest feeling. Sometimes, late at night, when Nathaniel and I sit by the fire in the bookshop, surrounded by the silent company of 10,000 stories, I think about the choices that led me to this moment. I think about my father, who taught me to value truth above comfort, and about all the women who came before me, denied the right to use their minds as I have used mine. I think about Cecilia and Margaret, about the lives they might have lived if the world had been kinder, if love had been allowed to flourish without the weight of shame and judgment. But mostly, I think about the moment I chose to trust, to let someone see past the detective to the woman underneath, to risk my carefully constructed independence for the possibility of something deeper. It was the most terrifying and the most necessary choice I have ever made. And as Nathaniel reaches for my hand in the firelight, as I feel the warmth of his touch and the steady certainty of his presence, I know it was also the right one. Love and murder, I learned that winter in the London fog are both about truth. One seeks to hide it, to bury it deep where it can never be found. The other demands that we reveal it, that we stand exposed and vulnerable before another person and trust that they will honor what they see. I have spent my life uncovering truths that others wanted hidden, but the truth I found with Nathaniel was different. It was not something I sought, but something that found me. Not an answer to a question, but a question that changed all my answers. The case is closed now, filed away in Scotland Yard's records as another example of how greed and fear can drive people to unspeakable acts. But for me, it will always be more than that. It will always be the case that taught me I could be both the detective and the woman, both the solver of mysteries and the keeper of my own heart's secret. I did not have to choose between my work and my life, between justice and love. I could have both, if I was brave enough to believe I deserved them. And so I begin each new case with that knowledge, that understanding that being whole means embracing every part of myself, even the parts that frighten me. The city still needs investigators, and I am still one of the few willing to look where others turn away. But now when I walk through the fog-shrouded streets, when I enter dark rooms and ask dangerous questions, I carry with me the certainty that I have someone waiting for me at home, someone who knows exactly who I am and loves me not despite it, but because of it. That, I have learned, is the rarest kind of truth and the most worth finding.